Hello, and in this session we're going to be looking at three of the small books of the Old Testament. So it's going to be Lamentations, Micah, and Zephaniah. So let's begin with the book of Lamentations. And this is a footnote, really, an appendix to Jeremiah's prophecy. So written by Jeremiah after the destruction of Jerusalem. And it's a collection of 5 poems or laments or odes that was written by Jeremiah as a sequel to his prophecies. So it's a lament for the destruction of Jerusalem. So just a reminder, it would have been written not long after 586 BC, which was the date that the conquering armies of Babylon under King Nebuchadnezzar captured Jerusalem, destroyed it, made King Zedekiah of Jerusalem blind, killed the princes, burnt the temple, and carried off most of the population to Babylon, recorded in 2 Kings 25. So it's an acrostic poem, which means that each verse begins with a subsequent letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So Hebrew has 22 letters. So if it was an acrostic in English, following this pattern, the first verse would start with A, the second with B, the third with C, the fourth with D, and so on. So it's a poem that I suppose is easier to remember. And so each chapter has one stanza or one verse, and except chapter 3, which I'll come on to in a moment. So each one has 22 verses because there are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. But chapter 3 has 66 because this chapter runs in triplets of verses, with each of the next 3 beginning with a subsequent letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And so it's 3 times as long, therefore 66 verses. But it's written in a way, I suppose, that would be easy for people to remember as they were learning it. And it's a desperate lament of what's happened to Jerusalem and the land, because the people had forsaken God, and therefore God had now forsaken them. Remember, it's always in accordance with the Old Testament covenant that God had promised. So the first chapter, verse stanza, deals with the afflictions of Jerusalem. So Jeremiah is bewailing the situation. As it's a poem, there are different poetic ways of writing. So one of them is that Jerusalem is made personal, so as though the city itself were talking, feeling, thinking. So in chapter 1 then, second part of the chapter, the city is bemoaning her plight. And it's a very dismal situation. Zion then, personification, Zion, the city of Jerusalem, confesses her punishment that it is just. So verse 18 in chapter 1. Chapter 2, we see 2 things. One is God's anger. So all this has happened because of the anger of God. So the first half of the chapter, the indignation of God. And the reason for that is the behavior of kings, priests, and prophets, verses 6 to 9. And so chapter 11, Jeremiah is expressing his great sorrow over what's happened. And then the second half of the chapter, Jeremiah weeping profusely. The second half of the chapter, it describes the miseries of the city. So the terrible disaster that's come upon Jerusalem, and yet the surrounding neighbours are gleeful, clapping their hands with joy. And again, using personification, the city is asked to pray. And verses 20 to 22, the actual content of their prayers is suggested as well, how the city should pray to God. Then we come on to the third chapter, third stanza. This is the longest one. Talks about Jeremiah's grief. He expresses his deep grief. And so we reach the highest point of the lament in this book. And Jeremiah is making his feelings known, bearing his heart, as he often did during his prophecies. No one had pleaded with the nation more than Jeremiah with passion. And no one was treated with more contempt by the nation than towards Jeremiah. Again, there's a comparison with Jesus here. Verses 139 talks about the affliction of Jerusalem inhabitants, yet there is a grain of hope at the future. And from verse 24, there is this belief, understanding that beyond the present sorrow of destruction, there is hope to come. As it says in Romans 8:28, God works all things together for good to those who love him. And this was his actions toward Jerusalem and Judah was the discipline that would lead to a better future. So once the nation had come back from exile, never again did they have a problem with idols. Then fourth stanza of the poem deals with God's anger, which has brought about this destruction. So it starts with a contrast between the glories of Jerusalem in the past with the utter destruction of the present. Verses 12 to 6 in chapter 4. There is no excuse for the priests and the prophets, so they had misled the nation. Verses 17 to 20. The nation had hoped for help from other nations, particularly Egypt, but no help was forthcoming. And there is no escape for Edom. Now, Edom is the little country next door, descendants of Esau, and we'll come to that when we look at Obadiah. The reasons why God was so incensed with the nation of Edom. So the final stanza, Jerusalem's prayer, personification of the nation, of the city. So they've been humbled. It's been a humbling spectacle, humiliating. A picture of repentance at God's throne of grace. And when we look at verse 1, chapter 5, verse 1, remember, O Lord, what has happened to us. Look and see our disgrace. Now, going back to Proverbs, chapter 14, let me just turn to that. This is an example of what Solomon had written in Proverbs chapter 14, verse 34. And it's as relevant today as it always has been, which says, righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a disgrace to any people. So referencing that proverb, that unrighteousness has caused the disgrace of and destruction of Jerusalem. So it ends. The chapter 5 ends with a look at the throne of God. Though earthly events happen, the throne of God is eternal and will stand forever. And once the suffering has been experienced, beyond that there is hope. So this little book then is just a footnote to Jeremiah's prophecies. He lived to see the destruction, and the book, the lament, is just his heartbreak. That's what has happened. So let's move on then to another little book, which is the book of Micah, one of the, it's called minor prophets because of its length, not because of its importance, but it's a very significant book, Micah. So Micah then was writing from 740 to 659 BC. So he started to prophesy before the fall of the northern kingdom of Israel. He lived through that destruction, and he was prophesying right down to the forthcoming destruction of Jerusalem. That would be happening in the future for him. So a key prophecy is Micah 5:2, which is well known because it's often read out at Christmas time. But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from old, from ancient times. So that prophecy, clearly a messianic prophecy, because in the days of Herod, he asked where the Messiah would be born, and that verse was quoted, he's going to be born in Bethlehem. So looking at Micah himself, he used, one thing that was very memorable for the people who listened to Micah was that he used wordplay, which is not apparent in English. It's only apparent in its original language of Hebrew. But it was a way of prophesying to towns and villages in a way that they would certainly remember. So just to get a flavour of what how it would go, let's suppose for a moment that he was going to prophesy to the Isle of Wight. So in the Isle of Wight, we've got certain towns. We've got Ryde, we've got Seaview, we've got Colwyn Bay, we've got the Needles, we've got God's Hill, we've got Freshwater. So let's imagine Micah was on the island and he was prophesying this coming destruction to the Isle of Wight. So the way he worded his prophecies was like this. So he would say, the inhabitants of Ryde will see their enemies ride off with their possessions. The only view they will see in Seaview is their enemies arriving. Colwyn Bay. Those who live in Colwyn Bay will be baying in anguish. The Needles. Those who live near the Needles will be pricked to their heart. Cows. There will be no more milk from cows, as their cattle will be plundered. God's Hill. As they cry to God from God's Hill, God, he'll not answer. Freshwater. There'll be no fresh water in Freshwater, as their enemies will stop up all their wells and streams, which was a common practice for invading enemies. So that sort of wordplay. So the people of those towns would have that ringing in their ears, and it'd be very memorable for them. So his name is a shortened form of Micaiah, which means who is like the Lord. So he came from the village of Morish Gath, which was about 30 miles southwest of Jerusalem. So he was a country person. So his contemporary, someone who was prophesying at the same time, Isaiah, lived in Jerusalem, but he was a man from the country. So he was a peasant prophet, and we don't know about his parentage, but he is well acquainted with the sins of Jerusalem, the city, the sinful city, and because the effects of that would have permeated down to the countryside. And so he expresses his great dislike of city life and all the evils that are associated with large cities. And so his condemnation is very much directed towards city dwellers. rather than his fellow countrymen. He wasn't impressed by the prosperity of the city, because he could clearly see the moral departures behind the glitter of the city. So he was put on trial at one point in Jerusalem, and he spoke in front of King Hezekiah the word of the Lord. Now, this trial is actually quoted many years later when Jeremiah was put on trial, Jeremiah 26, verses 17 to 19. So when Jeremiah was on trial, Micah 3:12 was quoted at that trial, and saying that, well, Micah wasn't convicted for saying the same thing, so why should Jeremiah? And maybe Micah's preaching helped instigate Hezekiah's reforms. So Jeremiah 26:19. So Micah himself sees himself as a part of the faithful remnant. Most of the population had turned against God, but he says, I am filled with the Spirit of God, Micah 3:8. So he was aware of being filled with the Spirit of God. He says in chapter 1, verse 8, that he's willing to go naked to express his views, prophecies. Now, he may well have done that. I mean, Isaiah was said by God to prophesy naked. Whether that meant complete nakedness or not having the prophet's particular coat on, I don't know. But it may well have been literal, just to get the attention of people. So he then lived through the exile of the northern tribes of Israel. So the time of writing, he was prophesying through the reigns of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, those kings. 742 down to 687 BC. His fear was that the Assyrians, when they came down to invade Egypt, so all the conquering armies had to come down via the coastal area, in other words, going through Israel to get to Egypt because of the hostile nature of the geography to the east of Jerusalem. And what Micah was afraid of was that the armies would come down, the Assyrians would come down to attack Egypt, and on their way back, they would then turn against Judah and the country areas, which were always the first ones to be invaded. The first area was the countryside. And he was afraid that the countryside would suffer first, although Jerusalem was the instigator of the trouble so far as God was concerned, if there was going to be any retribution on the nation. So this did actually occur in Hezekiah's time, when the armies surrounded them, but at that point Isaiah was prophesying, and Hezekiah was a good king, and God listened to his prayer and delivered the city. So under King Ahaz, Judah was forced to pay tribute to Assyria, so a heavy tax burden which all classes suffered. But the behavior of the rich landlords became worse. So, as always happened in these situations, those in power would raise the taxes from those underneath them, and they were confiscating property and evicting widows in order to raise the money. So Hezekiah had tried to reform the nation, but clearly there was no lasting legacy from that. And so Jerusalem had become a hotbed of intrigue, bribery, commercialism, materialism, and even a priesthood that could be bribed and bought. So this was the situation that Micah was prophesying into. Now, with these minor prophets, we often get a very good insight into the character of God, because they bring out the the character of God in their prophecies. And so that's true of Micah. So in Micah's book, he describes God as the God of Jacob, Abraham. He is the king, and he acts as a shepherd over the people. So this is describing God. He's the God of the deliverance of the Exodus, and the salvation in the conquest. So Micah reminding people that he is a covenant God, and this is who he is, and this is what he's done in the past. So a reminder of the covenant. In Micah 6:3-5, God refers to them as my people, and he appeals to them, and he says that he's chosen them from the nations of the earth, entered into a special relationship with them. Therefore, he has a special claim on them. And one of the consequences of that, as we saw in Amos, was that God saying, "You're chosen to be my light to the world," and therefore it comes with a far greater responsibility. So if you're not fulfilling that responsibility, then there are consequences to that. There's a lot of talk in Micah about justice or injustice. So these are enduring principles of God's morality that he expects from people, nations. So he requires justice in the law courts. He requires a moral conduct and the right attitude towards him and towards others. And in Micah's chapter 6 of Micah, a well-known verse about what God expects of people, which says, "He has showed you, O man," humankind, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you as the human race? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. So that describes what God expects. And so he is the God of the covenants, repeated. He's full of steadfast love and pity, gracious and compassionate and forgiving. But there's a time when God's patience runs out. So he is a God who will judge Israel and the nations, and he is the one that controls the destiny of the nations. So these are all things that come out from Micah's book. So looking secondly at the nature of Judah's sins, what is it particularly that God is highlighting for judgment? So social evils, and we can actually see all these things pertain right up to the modern age. So it's always very relevant. So Micah rebukes the sins of city life. There's something about the city with the population and the where people can sort of blend in and hide in the population that is particularly enables wickedness to happen. Out in the countryside and the villages, that's not possible because everybody knows one another. So the sins of the city life are rebuked. He rebukes the greed and injustice of landlords and nobles in the city who dispossess people. So even driving women and children from their homes. Cruel judges oppress the unsuspecting and the defenseless. And he goes on to say, chapter 2, that the killing of the innocent is as bad as cannibalism. So these are practices that are prevalent even in our own society. And continuing then the social evils, the rich keep themselves immune from law by bribery. So if you've got money, they were able to get away with bad behavior. Another thing that is very prominent in this book is, and it's also very relevant for today, Micah 6:10-11, false measures being used in trading. So in other words, weights and balances that were lighter than they were made out to be, so that the seller makes more money by cheating. And when we apply this to the modern life, it is essentially saying, in business, you've got to be fair and honest. So it was a dishonesty being in trading, in business, that was being condemned by God as well. And generally speaking, the social life and cohesion of the nation had completely broken down. So those were the social evils, and then moral evils. Micah 2:2, he refers to the works of the house of Ahab. Greed in Micah 2:2. Then Micah 6:16, the works of the house of Ahab. So what's he referring to? We're referring back to Naboth's vineyard, the greed of King Ahab, and Jezebel, who aided and abetted him to get hold of his land by foul means. Micah 3:1-2, justice is hated. Moral standards are disregarded. And this leads to family relationships with the consequent breakdown of family life. Right? How familiar are the things that Micah is talking about? This is God's assessment of that society, and it is no different to today. He condemns haughtiness or pride. Micah 2:3. The contempt of elders by the younger generation. Micah 7:6. So the lack of respect by the younger generation to the older generation. And then deceit, lying, and violence. So Micah 3:10 and 6:10-12. Deceit, lying, and violence, all things hated by God. And then he moves on to the false worship of God. So that when there's a complacency or lack of fear for God, if there's no fear of God, and if the prophets are giving a false prophecies of that's failing to speak of the judgment of God to come, then it leads to corruption in judges, priests, and prophets. They've turned away. If there's no fear of God, then there's corruption in those three categories. The people suffered from spiritual blindness and felt no danger. Although they turned their backs on God, they depended on riches and they depended on military might. Micah 6:12-15 and 5:10, which would not be there to protect them. And then Micah 2:6, true prophecy is suppressed. So this is a problem that a lot of the prophets had, that people did not believe the true prophets, but people believed the false prophets, because the false prophets would always say, don't worry, everything will be all right. God won't let bad things happen to you. So false prophecy was rampant, and they were happy to receive payment for prophesying what people wanted to hear. So religion had become meaningless without justice in the law courts, without love for God and for fellow citizens. Micah 6:6-8. The nation had no longer recognized the moral holiness of God and expects to be delivered from troubles whenever their conduct is, whenever they're under a threat, when they're receiving threats. Micah 3:4. So, we see a very similar situation in our modern society. The fear of God has gone, and it leads to all these problems. Micah 6:7, child sacrifice. Now, this is a terrible thing, but it was very common. And Kings Ahaz and Manasseh sacrificed their sons in the fire. 2 Kings 16:3 and 21:6. So God hated the child sacrifice. And we might say, well, people don't do that today. But what comparison is there between child sacrifice in those days and the sacrifice of the unborn in our generation, which abortion is the leading cause of death in the whole world? What does God think of that? Well, we can see the comparison with the two. We know exactly what God thinks of it. And then Micah talks about the coming judgment. So chapter 3 is like a courtroom, a law scene, where God is the prosecutor and the defendant is Judah, and Judah has no defense. God's going to judge the people because of their sins, which is inevitable, and God will not even answer their prayers. Micah 3:4. You know, it's a terrible thing when God doesn't answer. Micah 2:6-7. The false prophets will be disgraced. Now that's because the true prophets are prophesying truth. Destruction is coming. The false prophets are not. So they will be disgraced. The rich will be deprived of all that has been stored up, all they have stored up. Micah 6:14-15. The land is going to become desolate, and the people will become a proverb by other nations for destruction. Micah 6:16. So if the remnant of Israel, Judah, are to experience the saving grace of God, they have to remove all idolatry and all corruption. Micah 5:10-14. So Micah goes much further than Isaiah, his contemporary, and proclaims that Jerusalem, the royal city and the dwelling place of God, will become a heap of ruins. That's exactly what happened years later. So Micah, a country person, laments over the fate of the small towns in the region of the regions. Micah 1:10-16. But there is a future hope, and there is hope for the remnant. And what we find in particularly in the minor prophets, when they talk about the coming destruction, they always end with a vision of the future beyond the destruction, beyond the exile, and a gathering together. God is going to restore them because, again, that's part of his covenant with the people through Moses. He would restore them. So Micah 2:12-13, 4:6-7, God is going to gather them together again like a shepherd. The remnant who will now be chastened will be rescued from Babylon after the siege of Jerusalem. Micah 4:10, 5:1. And they will be restored back to the promised land after this judgment and after their repentance. They'll be restored back to the promised land, and God will rule over them forever. Micah 4:8 and 4:11-13. So looking forward then to the millennial rule of Christ. So they will overcome their enemies, and they will devote the spoil to the Lord. Micah 4:11-13 and 5:7-9. Syria will be broken as well, as will Egypt. And then God's going to bring judgment on pagan nations. So Micah 5:7 and chapter 7 talks about the judgment on other nations. Now, the Messiah is a feature of Micah's prophecy. So he's the one that we've looked at already. He will arise from peasant stock. So the peasants, the country folk were so despised in Jerusalem, that would be the very part of society that the Messiah would come to. And when he comes, he's going to restore the nation. The Messiah will reign from Jerusalem, and King David will be his accomplice. I think the way it will work is Jesus reigns from Jerusalem over the whole world, but the area assigned to Israel will be restored, and it would seem that David, resurrected, will be the king over, or the ruler over that land of Israel. Jesus over the whole world. And so that's Micah 5:2-4 and 7:14. And when the Messiah comes, his universal rule will be characterized by peace, justice, and equity, fairness, governed from Jerusalem. Micah 4:1-4. And this will be the center of universal worship. So we've got this magnificent view of what's coming to the world as the Messiah comes. So remember, this is all before the destruction of Jerusalem. So he's looking beyond that. Yes, there's going to be destruction. Yes, it's because of God is punishing you in accordance with the old covenant. But God will do as he promised, bring you back again. And eventually, when the Messiah comes, he'll rule the world in righteousness. So that's That's the book of Micah. And then we come finally to another little book, the book of Zephaniah, just 3 chapters. So let's just look at Zephaniah. So Zephaniah, a theme that runs, a prominent theme, is the day of the Lord. And so Zephaniah was a prophet to Judah, writing between 640 and 610 BC. So not too long before the destruction of Jerusalem. So the time in 2 Kings 22 verses 1 to 23. And so there are, through it, there are warnings to the nation of Judah, but also to other nations as well. So Zephaniah, then, he was quite an important person, in as much that he was a descendant of King Hezekiah. So we read that in chapter 1, verse 1. So he's part of the royal family. Not the only prophet, of course. And he was prophesying during the reign of King Josiah, as we see from the same verse. So he was the first prophet to be prophesying after the disastrous reign of King Manasseh. King Manasseh reigned for a very long time, and he was very wicked, and it was because of all the wickedness that filtered down to the nation during King Manasseh's reign that God said the judgment was come, even though there would be several more kings after him. That period was so bad that God said the nation can't continue. So Zephaniah was the first one to be prophesying after Manasseh. There was another king had a short reign after Manasseh, but Zephaniah was the first prophet then to do so. And his book then deals with the day of the Lord. It deals with judgment, and judgment upon Judah and judgment upon the Gentile nations. But beyond the judgment, again, the prophet's saying there will be a remnant, a purified remnant. So when he was prophesying, the northern tribes of Israel had already been taken into exile, judged by God and exiled. And after that very long and wicked reign of King Manasseh, the state of the nation was dire. So they were worshipping the gods Baal and Moloch, both very horrible gods with a small g, demonic entities. So let's just look at the chapter 1 then. So chapter 1 deals with the threats against Judah. So there's universal judgment coming, and all are going to be included. But judgment must begin at the house of God. So God's judgment began there in Judah. But 1 Peter 4:17 reiterates that principle, that when God judges, he begins at the house of the Lord. That's the first 6 chapters, 7 to 13, chapter 1, 7 to 13. Now Zephaniah begins to denounce the inhabitants of Jerusalem. The day of the Lord is coming, and it will be a time when God's going to punish various groups for their wrongdoing. And that day of judgment is very close, and it's going to be a time of great distress. And the day of the Lord is going to be universal in its scope. Now, the day of the Lord features in a number of books of the Old Testament. The ultimate day of the Lord is when Jesus comes back again, when God will visit judgment on all the nations and bring the whole era of human government to an end. But there's often foreshadowing events that foreshadow that day of the Lord. And so the destruction of Jerusalem, with all its distress and bloodshed, is a foreshadowing of that greater calamity when God comes and judges the world. Chapter 2, there's still a chance if people will humble themselves and seek the Lord and his righteousness. Such people would be saved from God's wrath on that day of judgment. And then in chapter 2, he turns his attention to other nations, those nations surrounding Judah. They're all small nations, but they all are significant. because they are enemies of God and they typify those who oppose God and his rule. Now, it's actually not a lot different from today. When we look at Israel, they're surrounded by small nations. So Gaza is the traditional place where the Philistines were, and Moab and Ammon, so the Moabites and the Ammonites, they were again to the east of Jerusalem, which today would be in the country of Jordan. And so Israel today, 2,500 years later, is still surrounded by the same countries that are hostile to it. So the Philistines are going to be destroyed and their land will be used by the people of Judah. The Ammonites and the Moabites, now these two nations are linked because they're both descended from Lot. Genesis 19:36 to 38 tells us the sordid story of the origin of these two nations. So the descendants of Lot's daughters, one daughter, the Moabites, the other daughter, the Ammonites. But they were always hostile to Israel, even though they're they're cousins, basically, related. But they would be destroyed completely because of their hostility towards Israel. And we see other prophets prophesying exactly the same thing about these nations. So Isaiah 16, Jeremiah 48, Ezekiel 25, they all prophesy the same thing. And the destruction of these two nations is compared with that of Sodom and Gomorrah, which is quite ironic because their forefather, Lot, was saved from the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. But, these many years later, they will be destroyed in the same way. They're not going to escape. And God's case against them is because of pride. And God says that of all the sins that he hates most, it's pride. I suppose pride is centered on, in a sense, it makes ourselves a God, isn't it? That we are the center of attention when really, or center of worship, rather than worshipping the true God. So it was their pride, it was their hatred of God's people, and it was their worship of other gods. But the day is coming when God is going to be worshipped throughout the earth. In verse 12, Ethiopia will be slain by the sword, and 13 to 15, the Assyrians will be destroyed. Now, Assyria was horribly cruel. They carried out atrocities on the people they conquered. And we know that because they chiseled their deeds into stone, and those stones have remained, and some of them are in the British Museum even today. But they're going to be destroyed, he said. And who would have believed at the time that the great city of Nineveh would become desolate? But it wasn't too long after that when Zephaniah prophesied that the Nineveh actually did be destroyed. And again, it was just like Babylon. It would disappear from view, covered by the desert. This huge capital city of the world at one point, just like Babylon became later a capital city of the world, both absolutely disappeared from view. Quite unbelievable at the time, yet God said it and it happened. Both will be not only destroyed but buried under the sand, inhabited only by desert creatures. Then we come to the last chapter, where he's dealing then with Jerusalem. Chapter 3, dealing with Jerusalem. Speaking of the sins of Judah and Jerusalem, for which they are to be punished. And we saw a lot of these in Micah as well. Oppressing others, lack of justice, rebellious, not following the ways of the Lord, failure to listen to correction by God through the prophets. So ignoring the prophets and ignoring God, ruling like wolves, greedily preying on those less fortunate than themselves, and getting rich at the expense of others. Human nature never changes. That's why the Bible is always relevant. It deals with two things that never change. One is God, who never changes. I am the Lord, I change not. And one is human nature, which has been wicked from the very beginning with the killing of Abel by Cain. So the Bible is always relevant in any generations. And again, like Micah, false prophets speaking only messages people wanted to hear and not messages from the Lord. And we can compare that with today, when churches only preach what people want to hear. Churches who follow the fashions of the day, embracing them and saying, God's happy with this, don't worry about it. God's a God of love, so all will be well. And people are happy to listen to that, but it's a false security. And that's what was happening here. People were only listening to what they wanted to hear from the false prophets who were not preaching the true word of God. And again, same problem that Micah mentioned, the priests were not following the ways of the Lord. Again, apply it to the current day. Religious leaders, church leaders who don't obey or teach the people to obey the true word of God. So all this is in contrast then to God's nature, justice and righteousness. So the punishment of other nations was a warning to Judah, but they ignored the warnings and continued in corruption. Verses 8 to 10, so the book ends on an optimistic note. So we've got a promise of salvation. Following the punishment of nations, there's going to be worship of God throughout the whole earth. We can compare that with Isaiah chapter 2, verses 1 to 5. The day is coming when Jesus is ruling over this earth, when all the nations will acknowledge him as king, and he'll be worshipped as king. So it looks forward then to the millennial rule of Christ, when all rebellious nations are destroyed, Battle of Armageddon, Jesus comes to reign. And then verses 11 to 20, Jerusalem will then be a very different place. It will be a place where the inhabitants will be humble and not proud. They'll be righteous. There'll be no fear. Jerusalem will not be punished again. The King of Israel, we know as Christ, will be there. God will delight in his people, and there will be rejoicing as his people's fortunes are restored, because the Lord's going to gather his people together, and they will be honoured among all the people of the earth. So the nation of Israel, they'll have Jesus, the world's ruler, as their king in Jerusalem, and the other nations will honour them. And then just finally then, the reference to the day of the Lord. So throughout Zephaniah, he refers to the day of the Lord. We've touched on it already. Other prophets also referred to it. Obadiah, Joel, Amos, Isaiah. And Zephaniah shows that the day of the Lord is going to be a day of terror and distress for all nations, both Jew and Gentile alike, because all the nations will come under the judgment of God. In the New Testament, the day of the Lord is referred to as the day of Christ, Philippians 1:6, 2:16, and also as the day, as well as being the day of the Lord, showing that both events are one and the same thing. So the day of the Lord in the Old Testament is the day of Christ in the New, or the second coming of Christ is what it refers to. So the day where God once again intervenes in world history in physical appearance. He did it in Bethlehem. He's going to do it again, but this time coming not as the Saviour, as he did in Bethlehem, but as the conquering king and judge. So this destruction of Jerusalem that is coming in Zephaniah's day is a foreshadowing of the greater destruction that's coming to the world when Jesus comes back again. So on both occasions they're caused by sin, but the destruction of Jerusalem caused by sin is just foreshadowing the greater destruction of the world when Jesus comes back and judges the nations. So that's the little book of Zephaniah. Just a few chapters in these minor prophets, but so important, the messages that they bring.